Hello, everybody, and wish you having a great day so far. My name is Paul Lalovich, and I will be discussing digital twin of cost. It's a point of view we have developed on developing a holistic view on the economics and finance of the nuclear power and the hydrogen cogeneration. So a little bit about me. I'm a lifelong management consultant. Spent a better part of my career working in emerging markets. Most recently, I have been working with the large enterprise startups here in the Middle East. Spent quite a few years of working in the high reliability industry, energy sector, predominantly a petrochemical, as well as the nuclear sector and the healthcare sector. So essentially, organizations that have a very, very minimal room for error. And for the past 3 years, I've been working with a nuclear program in the Middle East, in Abu Dhabi, and I have spent time working as an advisor as well as a contract consultant on a myriad of different topics. But the greatest focus was on organizational effectiveness. So just a bit of a background where my practice comes from. So typically as advisory in organizational effectiveness and strategy execution, we spend quite a bit of time with the clients working on the business transformation, as I suggested, organizational effectiveness, establishing Agile project management office, and change management. And ultimately, what this is all about, it's about sensible approach to business. And this is going to be the topic we'll discuss today. So what happens with organizations in the cutting edge technology space? They more often than not have an uphill battle when it comes to their financial viability. And this is why we work very closely with our clients to make sure that everything from the operating model, the key elements that will be required to translate your strategy into reality are put together with a well thought through process. Then we challenge the hypothesis and all the forecasts through our applied financial modeling, making sure that numbers add up at the end of the day. And then translating your operating model into the organizational structure and all the other elements of the operating model, processes, people, and technologies. So essentially, this whole journey has to come with some sort of design in mind. And that's why we like to refer to this approach business by design. So we worked with a myriad of different organizations across Asia and the Middle East. But one thing that's very unique in terms of our expertise, we work with the large enterprise startups, which is sort of an oxymoron, but it's very, very symptomatic here in the growth markets. Essentially, the government is backing up large organizational startups where you put tens of billions of dollars into a success of the organization. And the predicament and challenges are, very, very unique. So that's what puts us in a very solid position to deal with these kind of challenges. So let's take a look at the topic of the day, which is nuclear power and hydrogen cogeneration. Essentially, we look at this perspective from a viewpoint where this is an opportunity to really get back on track when it comes to financial viability of the nuclear programs. Again, we're not trying to isolate anybody, but this is a snapshot of what's happening currently in the United States of America. Out of 99 reactors that are currently active, there is a significant number of these operations that are financially struggling and they're on the ropes for a myriad of different reasons. But more often than not, it has to do with the operational challenges and the operating cost of running sound and safe nuclear power generation. So what can be done? Essentially, it all comes down to basics. So here is a very, very simplistic perspective on the economics of the nuclear power generation. So essentially, it comes down to these multiple dimensions. And what you have is your revenue. So your revenue is typically going to be limited by the prescribed, power generation. So is it going to be, 1,000 megawatt plant or, 4,000 megawatt plant? But ultimately, that's a finite number. This is how much electricity can be produced over a period of time. The other opportunity is going to be, the gross margin. So that's where the elasticity actually happens, because there you can actually identify a number of opportunities when it comes to effective management of your operating costs to generate opportunity for the improvement. And ultimately, the ultimate dimension is the safety. Everything that we do has to be done in a safe manner, and ultimately we need to ensure, that the power generation is conducted in the safest possible fashion in alignment with the full compliance. That said, what's really critical to differentiate here is that the core business in the nuclear power generation is power generation. It's not safety. So what I'm trying to say here, although the safety is extremely important, it's also very, very important to make sure that you have a profitable operation. Why? Because at the end of the day, there is an empirical correlation between the safety incidents, the number of safety incidents, and the financial viability of the operation. In other words, plants that are struggling financially tend to have a higher rate of incidents. So that's something to really keep in mind, because the way we look at things is that profitable operations will also be the safe operations. So that's, the math at a very high level. So what can be done in order to ensure that safe operation? So everything starts at a fairly high level of stratification, understanding your operating model that in a typical nuclear power plant generation scenario is fairly simple. That said, as always, the devil is in the detail. So making sure that you lay out your value chain and you clearly understand the opportunities for effective operating cost management is really going to be critical. So operating cost is clearly going to be the one side of the equation. The other side of the equation is going to be generation of additional revenue. So as I said, most of the elasticity is on the OPEX side, and the other opportunity is going to be about driving the revenue up. Typically, this was capped by the production capacity of the plant, but the hydrogen cogeneration is introducing additional opportunity for energy storing, as well as driving additional revenue for the nuclear power plants. So this is, the punchline that we would like to highlight. As nuclear energy is becoming an option for many countries around the world, this is definitely something to consider. And self-financing out of the cost savings that can be created and generated over a period of time is definitely an option to consider. So how does this all start? So essentially, since this is a high reliability industry, it's really important to have a very, very solid approach when it comes to building scenarios, business scenarios, that said, as well as the models. So one of the things that we would definitely recommend for consideration is development of the digital twin of cost. So how does this start? Essentially, it's a digital twin of your operations that's going to help you develop the point of view that's going to be so precise and so granular that goes to the activity level. Essentially, in a very simplistic way to describe this, I think that the best would be to say that this is activity-based costing that really pinpoints the true costs of running safe operations of the nuclear energy production. Because ultimately, the writing is on the wall. The single greatest barrier to profitability and cost management is lack of the understanding of the true costs. So how do we manage these costs? Clearly by looking at the big ticket items. So if you look at the breakdown of the nuclear power generation operating costs, the lion's share, the big ticket item, is going to be the total cost of the workforce. And as you can see here, there is a sliding scale of different scenarios. So when you look at the share of the operating cost associated with the workforce, the lowest on the one side of the extreme is in the retail sector, and the highest is in the nuclear sector. So again, these numbers can vary from operation to operation, from region to region, technology to technology, but it is a fairly significant, and upwards of 50% is going to be the likely scenario for the nuclear energy. So since this is such a big line item in your operating cost, clearly there has to be, a very, very well thought through approach in how do you manage it. So just to give you a bit of a visual on the impact of this cost. So if you look at the typical nuclear power plant with the 60 years lifespan, and the typical load for the power plant that has something like 2,000 megawatts, you're looking at roughly just under 700 FTEs for a full load. And over the period of 60 years, the amount of money that's going to be invested in this workforce is going to be staggering. It's going to be in excess of $20 billion. So what this really tells us is that, we really need to make sure that we pay close attention to effective management around investments in the total cost of the workforce, from a get-go. So as soon as the plant becomes operational, we really need to make sure that, this compounded factor is working, in our favor rather than against us, because you can only imagine, the outlook is going to be significantly different if we start high at the beginning, so the trajectory is just going to be significantly steeper. So what can be done? Essentially, it really comes down to effective management of the costs. And to be frank with you, I think this is a really, really good insight when it comes to effective management of the cost, because most of the people look at the cost management as a reactive, intervention, something, that's a corrective action rather than a strategic initiative that is built and designed around gaining a competitive advantage. So what we have here is a recent survey done by Deloitte looking at different drivers of the cost optimization. As you can see here, the vast majority of the respondents actually are using cost management to gain the competitive advantage in the industry. And this is, across the board, not precisely looking at a nuclear sector. But what I find very, very insightful and very interesting and thought-provoking, that this same mindset can be very, very relevant to nuclear energy space. Why? Because effective management of your costs is really going to drive the opportunities for investment, generating new revenue streams, and most importantly, gaining the competitive advantage in the market. And this whole thing starts by charting a very clear picture of what the success looks like, So with the approach that we're suggesting, so building your digital twin cost model is really going to help you, have a firm grip on the true costs and develop your optimization targets that will drive the overall performance and the success of the business over a period of time. And this is one of the critical steps, because without this line of sight and understanding how the costs are going to be managed, the organization might be falling into a political trap where different agendas are going to lead to a loss of focus and ultimately lead to a poor decision-making process that might impact, a fairly successful operating model in a very, very negative way. So let's look into a greater detail what the digital twin of cost is all about. So ultimately, it's a dynamic financial model that's looking at different elements and ultimately answering these three critical questions. What is driving my costs? Can I link activities to outputs and services? And are my processes cost effective? You know, it's a really music to any one CFO's ears. And ultimately, what's really going to make one organization successful versus the other one organization in this space is their ability to manage these questions very well, and most importantly, to drive the level of financial acumen among their leaders across the board. And not only the leaders at the highest level of the organization, but also business unit leaders and preferably, operational management, because that financial acumen is really going to drive the difference of being a standout performer versus being a mediocre or a laggard in your peer group. So where do you start? Essentially, the approach is not that different from a traditional activity-based costing. And ultimately, you need to kind of start developing your portfolio by looking at the cost objects. So you have to determine, what are your, critical elements that you will define as your cost objects. You need to bring them all together, and then you need to start developing a point of view on your critical processes across the organization, and how do you translate those processes into the value chain. Make sure that you have as rigorous as possible exercise to really map out this in a fine detail as accurately as possible. We all know that manuals and standard operating procedures and process maps can really reflect a different picture from what's happening on the ground. So we got to make sure that this is continuously perfected in a way that's really going to be the real-time information that reflects what's happening on the shop floor. And then we move into the identification of the cost elements. So we got to make sure that we review all the financial statements and break them down into a finest level of granularity in order to identify the cost elements. And then mapping the general ledger, so making sure that we attach the costs to the activities as well as the elements or the resources driving those costs. And ultimately, what's going to happen at the end of the journey, you need to validate the whole logic. You got to make sure that this is sound and really, really, reflective of the realities on the ground. So ultimately, I'm really, really not going to dwell too long on the details of this, but I'm just going to give you kind of like a high-level overview when it comes to nuclear sector. So the exercise is fairly straightforward. The name of the game is to produce electricity in the safest possible manner. And ultimately, the sophistication of other business operating models that typically require evaluation of geographies, markets, and types of customers, as well as the products, is really not going to happen here. But what's really going to be important is to understand the breakdown between the primary and secondary activities. And this is, on the face value, quite straightforward. But again, as I suggested, the devil is in the detail, and making sure that you have not only a strong point of view on this particular topic, but most importantly, you have internal alignment. Because as you can imagine, a lot of cost drivers happen in the secondary activities, and this is where the elasticity is actually the most prominent, as well as some of the elements of the primary activities. This is where the innovation as well as the digital transformation can kick in and really drive some transformative and game-changing opportunities for the operations. But ultimately, what's really going to drive the results in building your digital twin of cost is your ability to translate, your operating model elements with a fine level of granularity into the policies, org structures, as well as the processes to job and activity level. That's really going to be critical. So as long as you have the ability as well as the necessary resources and tools to break it down into a fine detail, to build it as a truly digital model that is capable of necessary flexibility, is going to be the game changer. And then ultimately, having a consensus on the processes is going to be a bit of an iterative process, because at the end of the day, we do understand, that processes are not static. They change with time. They change, with a bit different business scenarios, circumstances. The technology is driving the change as well. And as any living being, any organization is going to evolve with time. So making sure that you're building this model on the realities is absolutely critical. And then identifying your cost elements. One of the critical steps here is going to be understanding of your resource drivers. So how do you manage effective resource management, and how do you understand the correlation between the flexibility of those drivers moving in one or the other direction, and that impact on the costs is really going to require a subject matter expertise, deep vertical understanding of how the operations effectively drives results in your organization. And then what's going to be a very, very helpful in building this overarching model is understanding of the typical cost drivers, starting with what's going to drive the scale, the interrelationships, discretionary policies, all the way to linkages, as well as the integration and capacity utilization. Most of the action when it comes to the nuclear sector, you're going to find in the capacity utilization, as well as looking into the cost associated with a location, because those are the two elements beside the scale that have a greatest impact on the total cost of the workforce. And ultimately, what's going to happen with this allocation model, you will be able to have this bird view perspective of what's happening in the organization. You will really become the master of the cost management in your organization, having the ability to build multiple scenarios and creating these what if storylines and narratives puts you in the driver's seat when it comes to your future investment, but most importantly, capitalizing on the opportunities when it comes to driving alternative revenue sources. So just to kind of sum it up, the storyline, it's ultimately going to be the first step in the hydrogen cogeneration. This is the most viable opportunity for the nuclear sector to create opportunity for alternative revenue streams, as well as the energy preservation. And most importantly, it all starts with your ability to effectively manage the costs and to create a self-financing models that will ultimately get you over the top. So I would just like to use this opportunity and thank everybody for attending this brief presentation. It brings us to a conclusion. Happy to stay in touch. Feel free to drop me a line for any questions or suggestions. Looking forward to catching up with you in person.